time, we're going to talk about Model Context Protocol, a topic very close to my heart. When Anthropic launched MCP last November, like 1 week later, I already started building the first MCP server, and ever since I've been quite involved in the MCP work. So I can speak a lot from practice and experience. Also, if you have questions, feel free to ask the questions later on. Or find me later for any deep dive questions that you have. First, quick show of hands. Who of you has used MCP servers in your environment? So that's about 40%, I would say. Who has written an MCP server? 1, 2, 3, perhaps 10 people? Okay, cool. Awesome. But I hope we'll have something for everyone. And as I said, for questions, we can go later on. So initially, we can talk a little bit about AI and agents, but I really quickly want to dive into MCP and why and how it's important, and why we don't just use REST and Open API. And then looking a little bit from a developer perspective, there's on one side data APIs, but also infrastructure APIs that we want to connect to. So a little bit of context of agents and architecture. You've already seen this this morning. So basically, agents are applications that are not just do one-shot answers to users' responses, but they run in an agentic loop. And as part of this loop, they also call tools. And this tool calling is what we're talking about today, right? We're not talking about the reasoning and planning part of the agent, but more about the tool calling as such, right? So if you look at the architecture diagram, then you see on the bottom right here, like the APIs, tools, functions, databases, and other agents as well. And this is kind of where we're looking at. We're not looking at the models today. Although, I have to say, some of the recent models have been fine-tuned on tool calling. So if you're using tools with LLMs, try to use the recent models from OpenAI and Anthropic and Gemini, because they're much better at tool calling than the previous models were, right? So because they have been especially fine-tuned for tool calling to get better at deciding which tools to use, how to call them, what to do with the results, and so on. So one of the challenges of tool calling, I don't know who of you remembers the time before MCP. That was like 10 years ago or last December, I guess, right? So I've built a lot of integrations. For every individual agent framework, we had to build like a Neo4j integration. And every agent framework had to build an integration for this other thing. So everyone had to do a lot of individual custom implementations time and again. So you had to have basically a many-to-many issue, right? So because there was not a standard and people couldn't kind of agree to use a subset of OpenAPI for it, because OpenAPI is a pretty wide standard, right? So many people ask why is basically, don't we use just OpenAPI for that? It's a pretty wide standard, and then which parts do you implement, which don't you implement? Kind of, there's also some specifics about tool use and so on. So that was one of the issues. So we have many-to-many integrations between many vendors for tools and many consumers, to say so, which are then basically LLM frameworks, agent frameworks, agentic assistants, and so on. And so even if you build a tool integration once, it was not clear that you could reuse it with the next framework that came along, right? So then you had to build another wrapper, and then Microsoft came with something in Copilot, and you had to build another wrapper. And so basically, you were just building and maintaining all these wrappers, which was super annoying in the end. And your API is also developed, so you also had to update all the stuff again, time and again. So it was just a lot of tedious boilerplate work, which was not so much fun, as you can imagine. And you can vibe code your way only so far into things, right? So just to say that. Also, I have to say, if you're vibe coding or like use coding assistants for building code, start out by having them generate tests, actually. Look through the tests and verify that the tests are testing the right things, and then this gives you like a safety harness. If you're not going all the way to specs, like Simon just showed before, at least having a test framework gives you a more safety harness for building things like that. So that's something that's definitely quite helpful. And then the last point is actually quite interesting because there was all this tediousness, the quality of the agents, the tools was not so great. But if I look at the 5 million MCP servers that exist out there today, I guess the quality question is actually something, you have a wide spectrum of some that are really good and a lot that are kind of somewhere in the middle, and then a lot of crap as well, that where someone just sat down and did something, right? So what came out of this? By the way, if you haven't listened to it, there's a really good blog podcast from Latent Space with the creators of MCP, where they talk about how they came up with the idea, how they built it internally in Anthropic, how there was a lot of uptake and interest, and why they actually used like local tools first for MCP instead of remote servers. And it was really interesting to look a little bit into this history. What also reminded me, this reminded me of was when GraphQL came out in 2016. There was a similar like energy and motivation and open source spec and working group, and then people jumping on the train and lots of engagement there with like building tools and so on around it. So it feels very much the same vibes like 10 years ago around GraphQL. So if you want to learn more about the protocol and so on, go to Context Protocol. By the way, the model stands for model, right? The LLM model. The context is basically what you provide to the LLM. So this protocol is meant to help external sources provide more context to the LLM. That's where the name comes from, right? And why is this not? The Anthropic guys say it's like a USB-C port, right? So USB-C is the one where you don't have to worry about direction anymore, where you can just plug it in anyway, right? And you can plug any kinds of devices together with your computers or devices with devices. And so it becomes more like a universal adapter in a way, right? And the other thing, at least from a user perspective, it's also super simple to use, right? So you have like one-line config, and then all the other stuff happens with tool discovery and all the other things behind the scenes, so you don't have to worry about kind of the complexity that's in the USB-C plug and all the electronics that sits in there. It's basically handled and taken care of for you, right? So, and then there was broad adoption, right? So we saw Sundar tweeting about MCP, and then he got overwhelming responses, like I don't know how many thousand responses. And then he said, I love the feedback, so to MCP it is. And then Sam Altman did the same. And then Demis tweeted as well about it. Amazon is supporting MCP as well in Amazon Q. But Andy or Jeff Bezos have not tweeted about it. I tried to find a tweet, but I didn't find a tweet. And Satya also didn't tweet about it. At least I couldn't find it. But they are adding now MCP support to Windows. Can you imagine all the Windows functions and APIs are exposed as MCP servers? I'm not 100% sure how I feel about this, to be honest, also from a security perspective. But it's definitely commitment, right? So I still remember my Windows 1.0 floppy disk in 93 or something like that, or 92, I don't know. So anyway, so how does it look like under the hood? So in MCP, you have three main components. One thing that we mostly talked about today, and that in general people also mostly talk about, are MCP servers that are basically the vendor-provided tools that can have a number of components, which we'll talk about in a second, which can either run locally on your computer, which is kind of interesting, where MCP uses standard I/O as a protocol, like Unix pipes, basically sending data back and forth between the MCP host or the MCP client and your process. So in one way, it's kind of more secure because it runs on your computer and there's no leakage on your process. So whoever has access to your computer has already all the access. On the other hand, it's also kind of weird, but it comes from this history of how they originally built MCP and Anthropic. So the majority of all available servers are currently also local servers because the clients are all not equal in their support of new MCP features. So basically, if you look at 20 different MCP hosts, actually, there are very varying degrees of support of spec features as well, right? So some stuff that works in one host does not work in the other host, so that's a little bit annoying. And then the other one is hosted MCP servers, where you have an either HTTP API with server-side events or with now HTTP streaming, and it all uses JSON RPC under the hood, so it's basically like remote procedures calls. We go a little bit deeper what else is there. And then on the other side, you have the MCP host. It's a little bit confusing because most people say MCP client, but actually the thing like your agent or your Cloud Desktop or your cursor is actually an MCP host. And then it spins up one MCP client per MCP server connection. So the client is actually the sub-process which connects to the server. So nomenclature is a little bit confusing there, but things like Cursor or Cloud Desktop are MCP hosts, and MCP clients are actually the connectors that connect to a server. And then, of course, the MCP server exposes whatever you want to expose, right? So it can be anything from operations of your computer, files, databases, services, APIs, Google Docs, email, Slack integration, you name it. Whatever can be behind an API or whatever can be accessed in technical terms can go there. Cool. And so this is a little bit looking underneath the surface. So inside of an MCP server, we have also different capabilities. The most used one is MCP tools, which is basically like an RPC, right? A remote procedure call. You have a function with a description. Each function has parameters as well, which also have a description. And those are basically provided to the MCP client, and then the LLM can basically use these tool descriptions to make choices when to call which tool as part of the process of interacting with the user or interacting with the agent or other agents as well. So that's the most common thing, and that's what also everyone kind of has implemented as well, right? Which is the reason why most people say, why don't you just use HTTP basically, right? So because if it's an RPC call, why don't you just use HTTP directly? But actually there's more than that an MCP server can do under the hood, which is, one is resources. Resources are more like static or semi-static sources of information. You can think about something like, if your MCP server comes with like a database schema, right? So which is kind of more constant that you want to expose as a more static piece of information. That's not like a function call, right? So the function call is more like doing something, and the resources are more like, okay, we retrieve some more or less static information. Or if you have like documentation built in, or if you have like documents that you want to serve to the client, or files that you want to serve to the client, then resources are a better abstraction. And these resources can also be templated, so you can also have, query parameters kind of in the resources that you can then use to dynamically render them as well. And then there's prompts, which is also an interesting thing, which comes more from this AI assistant world, where these prompts, you can think of them as almost like an prompt wizard. Like, remember in the old days when you had installation wizards and like wizards for achieving something in applications? So like a prompt wizard is the same, just with text prompts, where you have templated prompts, where one prompt describes some functionality that you can do with the server. And then you can have a sequence of these prompts that basically guide the user through a process. For instance, imagine you are someone working in finance, and you have to do a due diligence process, and this process has like 5 steps, and you have an MCP server from a due diligence service that offers a bunch of tools. Then this would walk you through the individual steps that you have to take, basically. And in these prompts, there's like also hints on which tools should be called and things like that. And then there's something else in between MCP server and MCP client, which is called sampling, which is a weird name, where the MCP server can actually reach back into the client and use the LLM of the client to generate text or extract text or analyze text and so on. So it's kind of a back channel that can be used to get LLM functionality in the MCP server, even if you have no connection to an LLM in your server itself, right? So which is an interesting one as well. So, and one interesting choice that I don't really understand is that in Anthropic, an MCP made this a stateful connection, which is not really what you want to do when you have scalable internet services, right? So then that you have like user state basically in this level. You rather want to have your state either in a client or in a database somewhere. You don't want to have it in a server because that kind of bloats up the server. So that's one thing. And then the other big question, which we also get to in a little bit, is kind of security, which is a big open challenge for MCP, which started to be addressed, but in general, that's kind of where there's a lot of gaps still. So I already mentioned MCP hosts. So you have everything from Cloud Desktop, Cloud AI now. I think in ChatGPT, they still haven't added the MCP support to the desktop app. At least last time I checked, it was still not in there. VS Code now has MCP support, Cursor, Windsurf, Copilot. Studio at least has MCP support. I'm not sure if they already integrated MCP directly in the final Copilot. And then in Google, there's also Agent Space as the new offering from Vertex and Google that can pull in MCP servers as well. I mentioned already MSNQ command line client, Cloud Desktop, Cloud Code also supports MCP, and lots of other ones as well. And then the other big group of MCP clients or MCP hosts is actually agent frameworks, where you can plug your MCP servers into a large variety of agent frameworks, from semantic kernel to agent development kit from Google, to OpenAI's agent framework, to CrewAI, to Pydantic AI, and so on. Right? So that kind of comes what I said in the beginning about this is kind of this universal protocol where you write this MCP server once, and then you can use it with all these clients and hosts as such, which is really, really nice. And so in December and January, it was a little bit quiet around MCP, but then in February it surged basically, and everyone and their grandma, I hope your grandma also wrote an MCP server, not just mine. Everyone and their grandma wrote MCP servers, and these numbers are now already much bigger or much higher. And so there's also a plethora of MCP registries, because everyone thought, oh, let me build an MCP registry, I can be first. Anthropic itself, they have in their roadmap actually an MCP registry, an official one. I'm not sure when it's coming, it's been discussed quite some time. And last week I just saw on Mastra.ai, which is a new agent, TypeScript agent SDK, they have now an MCP registry, right? So a list of registries, right? Good, right? So I like that. Good spirits. So Mastra, of course, also supports MCP as well, which is kind of funny. Anyway, so there is a lot to choose from, and that's also one of the challenges, right? Which MCP servers should you actually use in your daily work, right? So it's something I can probably say now is, from my perspective, if you're playing around and do this in a sandbox environment, in a Docker container or somewhere where it's safe, using a bunch of open source test projects on GitHub and so on, you can use whatever. You don't want to expose your computer necessarily to anyone's MCP servers. But if you want to go more into, okay, I want to use this in dev with my team or so, I would only go with trusted MCP servers from the official providers, let's say with GitHub or Slack directly from Slack, or if you have something from AWS or so, where the provider actually provides the MCP server, or it's an open source one and you have read through the code and understood what it's actually doing, and you also pin the version, right? So because if you don't pin the version, the next release can do something different, or if it's one that you wrote yourself as well, right? So far, I have not seen any MCP proxies that do hardening, but I guess there might be some out there that actually do like input validation, output validation, and some hardening in terms of things as well. But please be careful if you use this in production. Always use trusted servers from people that you really trust, like your API provider, or things where you have the source code, read the source, and then also pin the version to that as well. So what I want to dive deeper into a little bit is, from a dev perspective, looking at data services, infrastructure APIs, and agent SDKs, how we can use MCP in these different places. So as I mentioned, we built a bunch of those with Neo4j, which I also use today as examples, but you can, of course, because MCP, right? So you can plug and play any MCP. So it doesn't matter if you use the MCP or the Superbase MCP or the ClickHouse MCP. They all work very similar from that perspective. So let's see. I switched to demo. I hope all the demos work. Let's see how far we get. So this is Cloud Desktop. And I have configured a bunch of MCPs here locally. So you can basically see I have here a bunch of MCP servers. I don't think this settings thing is getting bigger, but I hope you can at least see it a little bit. So this is basically a JSON file that you can edit here, and then you have basically the different MCP servers that you configure. It's basically usually a local, for Cloud Desktop, it's a local server that you provide some environment variables as connection credentials and things like that for. And these are all Python libraries that are run with UVX directly, right? So they've been added to the config, and when I start Claude, it connects to them, launches the MCP client for each server. So then I have basically these configured servers here in my config. Neo4j Aura, Neo4j Company Cipher, Neo4j Memory. And then since last week, because everything is moving quickly, right? You can now also configure remote MCP servers, but only in Cloud AI on the web, which are then also made available to Cloud Desktop as well. So you can also configure remote ones, like I did here for the Sandbox one and the Aura DB one. So I was testing out some remote servers here, that's why we have a few more. And then for each of these tools, like if you look at this one, you can basically enable and disable tools individually for the MCP server. You can also disable the whole MCP server. And you can also see what the MCP server provides in terms of tools, right? So for instance, here I have a lot of tools. Some MCP servers have just 1 or 2 tools or prompts, and some have a lot. Okay, let's just try this out. I have a connection to a database with a bunch of company information. What is some of the, or what are some of the industry categories in my company's database? So what it will do now is the LLM will look at my question, try to break it down into individual tasks, and see if for any of these tasks is if there's any MCP server available. And let's see what it has here. Exactly. So it basically looks at my instances, executes a Cypher statement to get some more detail, and then basically executes a Cypher query. So it takes my input, generates a database query, runs this database query. Usually it asks me if I should do this, but because I had run this before and allowed it to use the tool always, it doesn't ask me again here. So it runs this query, gets a bunch of results back. Can you give me the biggest categories and some example companies in those? So it now basically needs to think about, okay, how do I determine if an industry category in my company's database is like big, so it has a lot of companies, and how to get some samples. And so it basically generates an aggregation query. So Claude is actually quite good at using the schema to generate Cypher and runs this. And if everything goes well, it basically gets the results back and then renders those as such. Okay. So sometimes it goes weird and then does multiple tool calls, which is interesting. You can also tell it that it should all do in one query, then it will create one compound query as such. Right. So come on. Get done. We have a lot of other stuff to cover. Okay. So, and now as a next step, what I could do now is basically say, I want to create a visualization for that, or like I want to create code for this, or something like this. So, for instance, I could now say, you know, for these companies, collect the revenue and generate a visualization of the revenue of per category or something like that, right? So, and then we'll go ahead and create a bar chart. But I don't want to bore you looking at it running queries. Also, we can do this in the background. Some other thing, being a developer, that I would love to do is say, can you generate a GraphQL type definition for this schema? So basically, that's something where then we move over a little bit from a pure data, looking at data, to a more developer point of view, where it basically fetches the schema and then uses this information to then generate an artifact. Claude has these artifacts that actually has the GraphQL type definitions. So basically you can create this connection between your domain and your development environment. Of course, you can also run this from Cursor or Windsurf or VS Code. And then you basically have here a GraphQL type definition with like all the entities, all the relationships in there, and so on. So, and then I can basically copy and paste this into my project, and then I have already a starting point as well. One other thing that's quite useful from a dev perspective for these data MCP servers is imagine you have a project where you generate code for a relational database or a graph database or Mongo or whatever. And as part of your building your services, each of these services also has query code that's inside of the services, right? So, but while usually the IDEs have ways of checking the code, right? Linting and compiling code to validate that it generated the right code. For actually external API calls and external queries, it doesn't have this. But if you have an MCP server that is connected to a test database with your actual data, you can actually instruct it in your LLM or Claude MD or rules file that it should actually validate each of the queries that it generates in your code against the actual live database as well, right? And then it can also use this, for instance, to generate unit and integration tests using the actual live data in the database as well, right? So it's kind of another safety net when you generate code that it can actually evaluate and test these queries as well, which is actually quite nice. Okay, so it did this, and now we can actually run. While you do something else, you generate a chart, an interactive chart of the biggest industry categories by company revenue aggregated. So one thing that's really getting bad with LLMs is spelling, because they don't care about spelling, right? And so we let it do this in the background. So that's basically what's happening here. Is you configure a data MCP server connected to your MCP client, which can be whatever, right? And then it can, while it's interacting with you as a user, can run database queries and get information from the database, both metadata and as well as data. So actually the MCP server that does this is actually not a lot of code. It's like 200 lines of code. So where I just wrapped the Neo4j drivers in an MCP tool and then connect to the database on start, and then we basically make this available and you can connect to this. So we also built the same for remote servers. Remote servers is a little bit of a different story. We'll get to this as well. One tool that's actually super useful is Model Context Protocol Inspector, which is also coming from Anthropic, which is a small TypeScript application that allows you to test out and debug MCP servers, so you get also much more information about what's happening behind the scenes. So I have one running here. So I just connect it to a remote MCP server here, and then I can basically say, here, list tools. And then it shows me all the tools that are available, and then I can basically run one of the tools, and then it basically runs the tools, and I see basically the tool calls and also the details, what's happening behind the scenes when something goes wrong, kind of what's used, and so on, what is the response from the tool. So this is super useful, and fortunately MCP Inspector also supports all the other things like prompts, pings, sampling, and all the other things as well. So you can play around with this also while you're developing an MCP server. So MCP Inspector is really nice to use, just as a quick side note. So you can do all this kind of data things as well, right? One other area that I don't want to go too deep into today, I also need to look at time actually, is memory. So Anthropic provided a memory MCP server, which basically takes information from your conversation and stores it into a knowledge graph. And we kind of changed it to store it in Neo. But what's really interesting about this memory server is basically can capture and retain memory across conversations. So while you're interacting with your assistant, it can collect information about you or interests or topics that you're interested in, and then represent them as memories. And later on, when you reconnect for the next session, it has all this information available. So when you talk about something that you've basically discussed before, it can actually access these memories, and you don't have to explain it to it again, which is really useful. And you can even go one step further, where you say, actually, we want to have shared memory for our team, because you're working on this project together. So everyone who's interacting with their assistant can basically add memories, and then we're building up like an automatic team memory, right? So, I mean, I guess many of you have these projects where we bravely started a wiki with lots of intents of keeping it up to date and maintained and so on. And then 2 weeks later, no one could be bothered anymore to update this kind of stuff. But imagine from your daily interactions with the assistant, all the stuff gets automatically updated and refreshed, and then you can even decay out old information based on timestamps and stuff like that. And so you have a more live representation of what you're doing. So I won't go into this too much, but that's basically also working. So what I could do here in my Claude desktop. So here now it generated basically, it ran these queries to get the data, right? So one query to get the data with an aggregation query, and then now it generated this interactive chart, basically, and we see software companies have total revenue $1.1 trillion in this database, right? So and that's only a tiny database as such, and then the rest is power law, right? So even manufacturing and so on is, and then you can basically get different representations, and it really loves to generate JavaScript code, right? So it's really enjoys this, I think, right? So and sometimes it doesn't work. So what I can do now is save our conversation facts to memory, and now it can use the memory server basically to take whatever we discussed today in our conversation, and then it starts to add entities and relationships to this. And then we can later check when it's done what it all stored as information. So because all these databases are basically just running in my cloud account here somewhere there. And here we see already that it now started to add, let me make this a little bit bigger, information on some of these nodes. And so we see basically information about industries, revenue categories, and things like that. So imagine we have a real conversation about a topic, and it stores kind of these memories and can update the observations, update the relationships. Then it's basically connecting these memories together, right? And if this happens in a team, then there's even more of that happening. Okay, so and this works basically similar. Infrastructure APIs is something from a developer perspective which is really interesting, right? So most people, when they talk about tools and agents, think mostly about data APIs in a way. But what's interesting on the infrastructure side is no one really loves to use, or actually let's ask the room. Who loves to use like AWS CLI and G-Cloud CLI and AWS UI and this kind of things? Anyone? 1, 2, 3? Yeah. I mean, they're really useful, but it's really hard to remember all the parameters and what was the right combination of stuff that you should use, and am I logged in, and like all this other stuff, right? So, and why can't I just use the stuff from my conversation in my IDE automatically, right? So that would be my dream. Because then I also have, like Simon showed before, I have the context of my project as well, right? So I have all the information that's already available in my context, in my project, like what kind of deployments do I want to have, what kind of tests do I want to run, what kind of instances do we need, what kind of databases do we use, and so on. All of this is already available in my project. So it's basically, we can look at infrastructure APIs, imagine something like Cloudflare, AWS, GCP cloud providers. I can connect to Snyk, for instance. I can connect to GitHub and others, and just from the place of my IDE, right? So and basically it works the same again. This time our MCP host is not Cloud Desktop, but it's VS Code or Windsurf or Cursor, and we can add MCP clients there as well. And in my case, we took the REST API for the Neo4j cloud service, wrapped it in an MCP server, and then made it available. And let's see how well this works. Let me just start a new session here. I hope you can read this. List my Aura instances. Aura is the name of the Neo4j cloud service. And then basically it has, as you can see here, these MCP servers in Cursor settings available. I can enable, disable them. Here you see all the tools that are available. And then it asks me, can I run this tool? And then it gets the instances. And then it wants to get more detail on each of the instances to get more comprehensive view. And it goes ahead and calls these APIs, gets the information back, and then shows them to me as an, as an overview. I'm not sure what's the problem today. I don't know if you saw that OpenAI has status outages, so I'm not sure if NVIDIA chips have like a year 2000 thing or something like that. So, oops, status.openai. So it's kind of something is going wrong there. status.anthropic.com. It's also kind of flaky, right? So I don't know what they're doing today. Okay. Anyway, here we have my instances, and now I could ask it, for instance, I don't know, can you show them grouped by instance size and cloud provider or something like that, right? So, and then it basically uses the information which is already retrieved, so it doesn't have to do another call, and basically just gives me grouping by memory and cloud provider as such, right? And now we can also create a new instance. You can say create a new 2 GB Pro instance called AI-fokus on GCP. So and it basically uses the information that it has. It needs to probably get my tenant ID. Yes. So it gets the tenant ID, and it creates a new instance. And you can look at actually what the instance information is here: name, type, memory, and so on. Uses also the right region as well. Then it generates this, and it gets all the information. And now I can basically say add a end file for this database. I'll kill it anyway to my project with Neo4j keys. So it basically can add this end file automatically, and it can't edit these files by global ignore, so it uses end for the example. It's also okay, then I need to copy it myself, right? So stupid human, you have to copy it for me. And but that's basically how you can do it. And then you can connect to it and do all the things that I mentioned before with the connecting to database as well. Cool. And then, of course, drop the instance again. And we see basically in our cloud service, come on. So it's, yes, oh, it's already gone. Okay, that was quick. Actually wanted to show you how it's deleting the instance, but now it's already gone, bye-bye. Anyway, so you can imagine if you're, oh no, it was not. Was it probably in a different tenant then? Could be in a different tenant. So you can see basically I can also spin up Cloudflare workers, I can create EC2 instances. AWS has also MCP servers. Actually, let me show them to you, AWS MCP servers. So from AWS Labs, there's a bunch of MCP servers. And because they know how everyone loves AWS billing and AWS Cost Explorer, they even added a Cost Explorer MCP server, if you can believe it or not, right? So there's a core MCP server, documentation, CDK, Nova, Kendra, Bedrock, cost analysis MCP server as well, Lambda, and so on, right? So they basically added all these dev MCP servers that you can just plug in, and then you can use them from your IDE. Okay, that's about the dev MCP servers, I think, what I wanted to show. And the last one is Agent SDKs, where again the MCP host is not the IDE and not a client application, but it's an Agent SDK, like I mentioned, Crew AI or LangGraph or Agent Development Kit, which then connects to whatever MCP servers you have running, and then can do whatever you want to do. And here's an example with Google's Agent Development Kit, where you have your agent definition with name, instructions, description of the agent, and then as a list of tools, you basically have an MCP toolset where you can either use standard I/O parameters or SSE parameters for remote servers, and then basically run the MCP server. You can pass environment variables. You can also filter tools. So which tools do I want to use of this MCP server, one or more, and then basically use it from that perspective. So it's actually pretty straightforward. And instead of like a Python function as a tool in your agent, you have a remote or local MCP server that you can use in your agent, right? And then, especially in ADK, they have a nice development web UI that can show you basically which, when you do a request, which agent calls does it do, and what does it do behind the scenes. It's a little bit like MCP Inspector, but in an agentic context. It's not just like an individual tool call, but it's like the whole agent response. So if it has to do multiple tool calls, you also see this as well. So like here, it did like 15 tool calls to get all the information from this this database. And with ADK, it's actually as easy to do pip install ADK and then create the agent and then run ADK web, and then you get this web UI. I'm actually not sure if it's currently running localhost. Was it 8,000? I don't remember. Yeah, here. So we have the agents. I think the memory agent is currently not configured correctly, so because I killed the other database. But this is what it would look like, right? So it's basically you can create new sessions, and then you get like all the things behind the scenes here from the past sessions. Basically, you can click on it and see what did actually happen, which tool calls, why did it select certain tools, what came back from the tool, and so on, which is actually quite nice. Right. Cool. Oops. Sorry. Okay, and my last example is a more complex agent, which is multi-agent setup, where we have, again, this companies graph that I mentioned in the beginning, and where we added a number of kind of predefined tools, which are more like subject matter expert queries, where the subject matter expert actually knows what queries cover which part of the database. And we make them available as tools to an MCP server, and we use Google's MCP toolbox for databases, which is an open source project from Google, and you can configure, your MySQL, your Postgres, your BigQuery, your Cloud SQL, your LODB, or dgraph, or Neo4j database with MCP toolbox, and then you can basically define in a YAML file. I think I have it here. So this is what it looks like as a source. So this is where I want to connect to, and this is my tool definition. It's basically just a query with description for name and parameters, and then Toolbox takes care of like connection pooling, driver management, and resource management on all the other things. And then I can just deploy it, MCP Toolbox to Cloud Run, or you can also run it locally or wherever you want to run. It's just a Go binary basically that you can run. And then here, this is an example with ADK where the MCP server is not running as a local server, but it's running as a remote server. And so you basically connect to this SSC server params where you pass into URL. It fetches the tools and then makes them available as such. And in my larger multi-agent thing, I'm not sure why it's not rendering the image here. It did yesterday. Anyway. It has like the root agent, which then has like a database agent, investment agents, and investor agents, each of which uses sometimes Python tools, sometimes MCP tools, basically depending on what you want to do. And then they pass control back and forth between, depending on the question, who can answer this part of the question, and then compose the answer in the end, as such. So, and in closing, a little bit on MCP challenges. I already mentioned security a few times. So I just had a chat with Simon, and the question was, where's the S in MCP, right? So where's the security in MCP? So I think this is all very much a grassroots-driven effort right now. And because Anthropic was coming from this local Cloud Desktop point of view, they kind of ignored the security question for a little bit too long. But in end of March, there was a new OAuth addition to the spec, which is now revised again, interestingly, with Microsoft. And for remote MCP servers, there will be an OAuth flow so that you can do basically a proper web OAuth flow with an IDP provider. But there's still a lot of security questions open. You might have also seen on social media or LinkedIn MCP attacks from different people on GitHub and other servers as well. So that's why I said at the beginning, if you use the stuff, use it in environments where you're either experimenting or where you can really trust these servers. The root cause is actually not MCP. The root cause is that an LLM has instructions and data at the same level, and there is no isolation between instructions and data, and that's why it can't differentiate, and that's why it treats data as instructions as well, which is a base flaw of the approach, but that's actually unrelated to MCP. MCP just makes it easier to, combine the wrong Lego blocks and then get these kind of things out. The other thing with the MCP registries, you've already seen this. So there's a lack of package management, software supply chain. How do I publish, version, validate packages? How do I deploy packages, install them from Docker? There has been some stuff. Some other folks also, different languages and so on. That's one big other big area. And deployment I already mentioned. Most servers are currently local servers, but what you actually want to have is remote servers that are hosted by a vendor that you can trust, and then have basically just integrate your IDP or your Okta or whatever flow to that. And then the other thing that's super annoying is that all the different clients have different levels of support for the MCP spec. So you can't trust when you implement something that it actually works in all the clients. Only MCP servers with tool work actually everywhere, but something like prompts or resources or remote servers is very mixed support. So that's still quite frustrating. And then the other thing that I also mentioned is the statefulness for connections. Cool, and if you want to learn more, there's a bunch of stuff where we've written blogs and so on, but happy to also answer questions later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. There's no time for questions, but please rate this session.